The rooftop bar had been chosen for its skyline views, which my brother had researched and confirmed, looked best after 6 in the evening, when the light caught the bridges over the Willamette. Everything about that night was curated that way. The small plates from a catering company he'd name-dropped twice in the car ride over, the specialty cocktails with a logo he'd had printed on the cocktail napkins, the particular mix of commercial real estate professionals and potential investors he'd spent 3 weeks assembling. I had helped him put the guest list together. I had also reviewed the venue contract 2 weeks earlier and caught a liability clause buried in the force majeure language that would have exposed him to full replacement costs if any vendor canceled within 48 hours. I fixed it in a single phone call with the venue coordinator and sent my brother a revised agreement that he signed without reading. He said thanks in the voice he used when he'd already moved on. I arrived at the event like any other guest. Found a spot near the edge of the crowd, kept a drink in my hand, talked to people I didn't know about the Portland Development Corridor and the South Waterfront projects underway. I was comfortable at the margins of my brother's performances. I'd had 31 years of practice. He found me at 7:40, when the room had hit that comfortable hum of people on their second drinks. He steered me by the shoulder toward a woman standing near the railing with the city behind her, and he said it in that particular tone, the one that sounds like affection but is actually framing. "Mirelle, this is my sister. She does something with leases, small commercial stuff." He smiled the smile he'd been practicing since high school. "You know how it is. Some people find their calling, some people find a niche and just kind of stay there." The woman turned toward me, silver-haired, late 50s, with the stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms full of people talking and had learned exactly which ones were worth listening to. She held my gaze a beat longer than social courtesy required. "Corinne," I said and shook her hand. She nodded slowly. Something crossed her face. Too quick to name, but there. Then my brother was already pivoting toward his pipeline presentation, and I drifted away, and 20 minutes later I made an excuse about an early morning and drove home alone over the Burnside Bridge, with the windows cracked and my hands too tight on the steering wheel. If you know what it feels like to be summarized in one casual sentence by someone who was supposed to know you, not attacked, just reduced, then you know why I drove in silence. Stay with me, because the story doesn't end on that bridge. I run a tenant representation practice out of a small office in the Pearl District. Have for 6 years. Before that, I worked for a commercial real estate law firm handling lease disputes, and before that, I spent 2 years reading every commercial lease I could get my hands on, because I'd watched what a bad one did to my father. He owned a hardware store in Northeast Portland for 14 years. It was his father's business originally. The kind of neighborhood place where people came as much for advice as for supplies, where my dad knew every regular by name and kept a wall of photos of projects customers had sent in. He lost it when I was 19, not because the business failed. The store was profitable. He lost it because in year 3 of a 5-year lease, the landlord began escalating common area maintenance charges through a loophole in the expense cap language that my dad's attorney had missed at signing. By the time my father understood what was happening, the fees had made the location financially impossible. He was out within 18 months. The wall of photos went into boxes in our garage. He took a job in warehouse inventory and never talked about the store directly again. I spent the years since then, making sure that particular thing didn't happen to other people. The work is not glamorous. I review lease documents that can run to 60 pages and identify the language that will ruin someone 5 years from now. I negotiate with landlords who do this professionally, on behalf of tenants who mostly don't. I catch excessive CAM reconciliation charges, hidden administrative markups, personal liability guarantees that shouldn't be personal at all. I've saved small business owners from contracts that would have destroyed them, and they send referrals and sometimes baked goods, and I've built a practice entirely on that. No pitch deck, no investor cocktail event with a logo on the napkins. Just a phone number that moves through people who needed help and got it. My family called this the paperwork thing. My mother said it in the tone she used for things she didn't quite know how to place. Polite, a little uncertain. My father, on good days, said he was proud I'd found my thing in the same register he used for cousins who'd taken up woodworking. My brother said almost nothing about my work, which was the most efficient way to communicate that it didn't register. What they didn't know was that I had also been the person they quietly called when something actually needed fixing. My brother had asked me twice in the 3 years before the mixer to look at lease agreements for his own apartment situations. My mother had called me in a panic 2 winters ago when a contractor sent a final bill that didn't match the signed scope of work, and I'd read the contract over the phone and told her exactly what to say. My cousin on my father's side had come to me when she wanted to open a food cart and couldn't afford the consultant who'd quoted her $9,000 to navigate the county licensing requirements. I'd spent a weekend in doing it myself for free, and she'd launched successfully for $2,000 in fees. Nobody connected these things to each other. They connected each of them to whatever felt most convenient at the time. My brother's apartment situations resolved themselves. The contractor backed down. My cousin's cart opened. These things just happened. 3 days after the mixer, my phone rang. A 503 area code I didn't have saved. Corinne, this is Morel Ashton. We met briefly at your brother's event. I set down my coffee. She asked if I had time to meet this week. No agenda mentioned. I said Thursday worked, and spent the next 2 days trying to figure out what she wanted, and couldn't. She arrived at my office exactly on time. She looked around the space the way people look when they're actually registering what they see. The framed lease redline I keep on the wall was because the clause I caught in it was the one that nearly cost a restaurant their entire 5-year investment. The whiteboards covered in CAM reconciliation math from the week before. She sat across from me at the small conference table and didn't bother with small talk. 8 years ago, she said, I owned a mixed-use building in the Lloyd district. Our anchor tenant was a healthcare network that had signed a 15-year lease. We'd leveraged that lease to fund construction debt on 2 other properties. It was the financial spine of everything we had. The shape of the memory started returning before she finished the sentence. Their legal team found a termination clause, language in the original agreement about structural renovation rights that their attorney was interpreting as an exit trigger. If they walked, we'd default within 90 days. We had maybe 6 weeks. She paused. A young woman contacted me directly. No referral, no pitch. She said she'd pulled the public records on the property and thought she might be able to help. She spent 3 weeks working through the lease history. The original agreement, every amendment, the correspondence file going back to the prior ownership. She found an estoppel certificate the tenant's own general counsel had signed 7 years earlier that foreclosed the interpretation they were now arguing. She built the counterposition. She presented it to the tenant's attorney herself. I remembered the apartment I'd been living in then. The documents spread across every flat surface. The tenant's attorney on the phone, a man in his 50s with the particular exhausted arrogance of someone who assumed he already knew how things would end. The tenant withdrew the termination notice, Morel said. We didn't default. That building is worth roughly 4 times what it was then. My company today is built on the stability that came from those 6 weeks holding. She opened the leather folder on the table and slid something across to me. A business card, my name, a phone number I'd stopped using 6 years ago, the same clean layout I still use today. I kept it, she said simply. When I asked you to send an invoice, you said you were building your practice and couldn't take fees from someone in genuine crisis. I've thought about that more than once. I looked at the card. That engagement had been early enough in my work that it felt less like a milestone and more like a test I was trying not to fail. I had filed it away and kept going. Last night I drove home thinking about the way you stood there when your brother introduced you, she continued. No defensiveness, no performance. Just a steadiness I recognized. I went back through my files. She gave me a moment with that. Why come now? I asked. Because what your brother said about you didn't match the person who saved my company. And because, since that evening, I've been paying close attention to some things I'd already started to notice about his work. What she told me across 2 more meetings was organized with the precision of someone who had been in business long enough to know that the difference between a problem and a crisis was usually documentation. My brother had been presenting himself to Morel's investment team as the lead architect of a South Waterfront mixed-use development. He had circulated a project summary with a projected return of 22% and a committed equity stack of 4 investors. Her analyst had started pulling threads. 2 of the listed investors had signed letters of intent, not binding commitments, a distinction that had been deliberately obscured in the language. A third so-called committed partner had agreed in a text exchange to think about putting in $50,000. A fourth commitment had been fabricated entirely. His title on the materials, Director of Acquisitions, was one his firm had recently, and formally told him he was no longer authorized to use, following a conduct review that had raised concerns about how he was representing himself externally. He had kept using the business cards. There was also the matter of Gabe. Gabe was a junior analyst at my brother's firm who had spent 8 months building the South Waterfront financial model from scratch. Market comparables, cash flow, projections, sensitivities analysis, a complete investment memo. My brother had joined the project in its final weeks, removed Gabe's name from the document header, and presented the work to senior leadership and outside parties as his own original analysis. My brother received a performance incentive tied to the deal. Gabe received a thank you in a team email my brother had drafted. His firm's legal team is already involved, Morel said. Oregon's securities law treats material misrepresentation to investors seriously, particularly when it's documented and deliberate. I don't know the exact outcome yet, but I don't expect it to be quiet. I sat with that. I wasn't surprised in the way that produces shock. I was surprised in the way you are when you've spent years editing a story in your head that the facts had never actually supported. Morel made me a formal proposal on our 3rd meeting. Her firm was acquiring 2 smaller property management companies, one in Tacoma, one in Eugene, and the consolidated portfolio was triggering regulatory compliance obligations she needed outside expertise to navigate. She needed an independent consultant to audit the lease structures across all 3 entities, identify outstanding liability, and build a compliance framework for the integration. 5 to 7 months, $195,000, with an option to extend into an ongoing advisory role. I asked hard questions. She answered all of them. I told her I couldn't have any role in decisions that touched my brother's situation. She said that was separate and would run its own course. I signed the agreement that Friday and sent it back electronically before noon. My brother called the following Tuesday. I answered on the fourth ring. His voice had been stripped of its finish. He wanted to meet in person. We sat at a coffee shop on Alberta Street, a place with no associations for either of us. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in the back corner with an untouched coffee, wearing a fleece instead of a blazer. He looked like someone who had been running on something artificial and had just run out. He told me Morel's team had issued a formal withdrawal notice. His firm had suspended him pending investigation. 2 investors had sent disengagement letters with attorney names in the signature lines. Then he asked me to lie for him. He didn't use that word. He said he needed me to contextualize things, to tell people who might ask that we had worked closely together over the years, that he regularly consulted me on deal analysis, that my professional standing in the Portland commercial real estate world was connected to his process. The language was careful, staying just close enough to plausibility that we could both pretend the conversation was something other than what it was. He said we were family. He said family stood together. He said it the same way he'd said everything over the years that he wanted me to absorb without examining. I'm not going to say things that aren't true, I told him. His face went somewhere I hadn't seen before, past the practiced warmth, past the performed confidence, into something older and harder. You're really going to let this happen to me? Your choices made this happen, I said. I'm not part of it. He followed me to the door and said things I didn't respond to, that I'd always resented him, that I was jealous of what he'd built, that the family would see exactly what I was. That evening, working late on an audit for a medical office client, I received a notification from Morel's firm's secure document sharing platform. A new folder had appeared, flagged by their compliance team. Inside were emails appearing to come from a domain nearly identical to my professional address, 1 character different in the extension. The content described, in specific technical language, methods for reclassifying personal expenditures as business development costs, and for presenting uncommitted investor interest as binding capital in deal summaries. The emails were addressed to my brother's work account and time-stamped across a 3-week period. They had been created to make it appear that I had been coaching him on how to commit exactly the fraud he'd committed. The timestamps were all clustered within the same 4-hour evening window. The IP logs, when Morel's IT team pulled them the next morning, traced back to a device registered in my brother's name, accessing a public network 2 blocks from his apartment. I documented everything myself. Exported the metadata, wrote a statement for Morel's compliance officer, provided a separate one when the firm's legal team requested it. I was calm throughout. I had the kind of paper trail that only exists when documents are your product and you've spent years learning exactly how to build one. The attempt didn't gain traction. What it did was settle something I'd been telling myself wasn't quite true, that my brother's dismissal of me was passive, a kind of disinterest. It wasn't. It was active, and when he needed a surface to deflect consequences onto, I was the obvious choice, because he had never believed I would know how to fight back. My parents called throughout November and into December, my mother more than my father. Their understanding of the situation had been filtered through my brother's version of events, which positioned me as someone with influence who was choosing not to use it on his behalf. I tried twice to explain the actual facts. Both calls ended with my mother saying she hoped I'd think about what family meant, and my father sighing in the way that meant he'd run out of things to say that wouldn't make things worse. My Aunt Yvonne called once briefly and said only that she was glad I was well and that she'd be in touch soon. She lived in Milwaukee in a craftsman house she'd owned since the 90s. My mother's older sister, a retired high school history teacher, who had spent her career teaching students to read primary sources and think about who wrote them and why. She had always been the quietest person in any room. I had learned over the years that her silences were not emptiness, but accumulation. In early December, letters arrived, physical mail with stamps, one to each person in the immediate family and one to a handful of cousins. Dinner. Sunday, her place. Please come. My note was separate. I've been quiet long enough. I need you there. The evening was cold and clear. My parents were already inside when I arrived. Two cousins I rarely saw, my brother who came last and sat across from me without meeting my eyes. Aunt Yvonne served pot roast and waited until the bread had been passed before she set her fork down. I want to say something I should have said a long time ago, she began. Her voice was clear without any performance in it. This family has spent years calling Corinne the one who didn't quite figure things out. I want to be specific about what that's actually looked like. She started with our grandfather's estate. He had died 11 years ago. His will had designated equal portions of his savings to each grandchild for educational and professional development. The shares were $22,000 apiece. Mine had been redirected, through a transaction my parents authorized and did not disclose to me, into a joint account used to cover my brother's first-year graduate school deposit, his relocation expenses, and the security deposit and first month's rent on his apartment in a city 3 states away, because my parents had felt it was important he start right. I had known about the redirection for 3 years, discovered through a county records search on an unrelated matter. I had made the decision not to raise it because I couldn't see a version of that conversation that ended anywhere useful. I had kept the knowledge the way you keep something heavy that you've learned to carry, present, just below the surface, affecting your posture without anyone seeing why. My mother's hand was very still on the table. Aunt Yvonne continued. She described the year she had faced a landlord dispute over fabricated exit inspection charges on her own apartment, damage claims that didn't exist, totaling over $1,100 in wrongful deductions. She had gotten every dollar back and a written retraction from the property management company. She said she'd kept the retraction letter. She said I had handled the whole thing in a weekend without mentioning it to anyone. She described my cousin's food cart, the $9,000 consultant, the weekend I'd spent instead, the cart that had been operating for 2 years now with a part-time employee. She described a winter 2 years ago when my parents' escrow account had run short on their homeowner's insurance renewal. $400 I had transferred to their checking account without explanation. They'd spent it without question because the timing had worked out, and they'd assumed the math had simply sorted itself. I'm not telling you these things to embarrass anyone, as Aunt Yvonne said. I'm telling you because the story this family has been telling about Corinne, that she never quite committed, never quite arrived, is a story that doesn't hold up. And you are all people who should know what it means when evidence doesn't support a conclusion. My brother said something about the timing and how this wasn't what anyone needed. Aunt Yvonne turned and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been waiting a specific, measured amount of time for exactly this moment. Given the past 2 months, she said, with a gentleness that somehow made it more precise, I'd encourage you to let other people assess what's needed here. Nobody disagreed. Dinner ended early. People left in the careful way people leave rooms where something true has been said and no one is ready to respond to it yet. I hugged my aunt at the door for a long time. She said she'd been carrying those things for years and she was glad to set them down. I told her thank you and meant it completely. I drove home slowly through lit December streets and sat with the specific feeling of having been witnessed. Not vindicated, that's the wrong word because it implies a contest, but witnessed. Like the difference between a document that exists somewhere and a document that has finally been entered into evidence. That was the last family gathering I attended. I changed my phone number in January. I set filters on both of my email accounts. A handful of letters have arrived since then, and I've read each one once and not responded. Not from anger, that part had already passed, quietly in the months before. Just from the recognition that access to me had never been, for most of them, really about me. It had been about what I was available to provide. The consulting engagement with Morell's firm wrapped in August, a month ahead of schedule. The integrated compliance framework cleared state review without revision. She offered the extended advisory role we'd discussed, with equity participation in the firm's next acquisition vehicle. I accepted. My brother's situation resolved the way these things do, slowly, without ceremony, in civil court filings and regulatory letters that became part of the public record. His former firm won a judgment for misrepresentation-related damages. The Oregon Division of Financial Regulation issued a 2-year bar on his involvement in investor-facing activity. No criminal charges were filed, though the civil judgment followed him into background checks and complicated a number of things for a number of years. He found contract work eventually, property management tasks that didn't require an investor-facing title. His name in the Portland real estate world had a particular quality now, not notorious exactly, just the kind that made careful people do extra due diligence before returning an email. I hear about this the way you hear weather from a city you used to live in, informative occasionally, not something that requires a response. My practice kept growing in the ways that matter. 2 associates now, a caseload I choose rather than take out of scarcity. Pro bono work for small business owners who can't afford representation, the same situation I once couldn't afford either, doing the work that changes things before anyone thinks to ask whether I've figured out my thing yet. I think about my father's hardware store sometimes. The photos on the wall, the way the afternoon light came through the front windows. What it cost him, and what it cost us, and what a single paragraph of contract language, read carefully, negotiated firmly, by someone who knew what to look for, might have changed. That's why the work is what it is. That's why I do it without the rooftop and the cocktail napkins with the logo. Some things are built to last. Some things are built to look like they're built to last. Learning to tell the difference was the most valuable education I ever received, and I earned it one document at a time, in the years when nobody was watching, which, it turned out, was exactly the right way to learn it.